Adam, thank you for your time. It's a pleasure for me to be on the question time seat for you.
Well, it's fun for me to give answers rather than ask questions.
Thank you so much for joining this conversation. We have at the moment 70 elections going on this year, and a number of them have already passed. And everyone speaks about this mega election year and how the UK elections and all the other major elections will affect our new geopolitics and the balances. Looking ahead or looking back now at the EU elections that we just had a few days ago, we run a major shockwave through Europe. Far right has re-emerged. The media in the UK and in the EU has covered it in the last few days. What's your reflections on the trends where Europe is going?
Well, one thing I would say is that predictions don't often work out, do they? I mean, so I think as you approach the UK election, we should be cautious as to the extent of the result. I mean, for example, it was conventional wisdom in India that Narendra Modi's BJP were going to break through, possibly get a supermajority. Well, they didn't get that. They're now governing in coalition. And likewise, in the European elections, as you say, there was a lot of talk about the rise of the far right across Europe, whereas what we've seen is quite a partial picture that certainly in France and in Germany, major drivers of the European Union, the radical right has done extremely well, but in other countries, Sweden, for example, they haven't done so well. And actually in Hungary, which is often focused on as the home of the nativist right in Europe, although Orban's party won, he's now got quite a significant challenge, more centrist challenge on just to his left from a former colleague. So you can't necessarily predict. What we can say about these European elections is that the right, the traditional right, the European People's Party, and just next to them, the party which actually was founded by David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister, the ECR, are both stronger. So there has been a shift to the right, but perhaps not as far as everyone was expecting.
Thank you, Adam. That brings me actually on to my next question. I mean, over 7 countries, as you just outlined, have voted for the far right in Europe, but the Conservatives have mainly won, which is the fact that we're dealing with. However, looking at our young demographics, we have over 37% of young voters in France, over 17% in Germany, and others have voted for the far right or far left. How are we appealing to our young voters going forward? And are we missing something in our new responsibilities in approaching young voters?
Well, I certainly think there's a generational change in as much as a culture dominated by baby boomers was a kind of post-Second World War culture, which inevitably people had views about the far right as being fascist. And as we can see, for example, in the stances which have been taken over the Israel-Palestine conflict, there was a widely shared view that Israel had to be supported in all circumstances because of what had happened to the Jews during the Second World War. Now, obviously, those imperatives have receded with the younger generation who see things perhaps more as they would see it in straightforward human rights terms. And also, one of the significant changes has been in the West a growth of economic pessimism. The parents no longer feel confident that their lives and the standard of living of their children is going to be bigger and better than theirs was, whereas previously that was an assumption throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s and beyond. And finally, there's been one other change, which has been the democratization of communications because of electronic media, digital media, smartphones, and the rest of it, social media. It means that controlling the message or making sure that there is a consensus on what matters and what doesn't matter is impossible because everyone effectively is a mini broadcaster with their iPhone. So all of that, I think, has unsettled the younger generation. They're not so certain as to where they want to go. That the economic slowdown in the West has also meant that their prospects perhaps aren't as bright. So it's not surprising that they prepared to look away from the mainstream of centre-right, centre-left, which has pretty much dominated European politics for the last 80 years or so.
Thank you for that reflection, Adam. Which brings me on to the point, focusing a bit on the United Kingdom. Do you believe there will be a domino effect long term of having the far right, far left voting sentiments of the youth reflecting on our elections coming up in a month's time?
Well, I'm not saying young people are fascists, and actually, I think that a lot of them, as I say, have very serious concerns about human rights issues, about green issues, about climate change, and all the rest, and to a certain extent are willing to hold their parents' generation to account for what's gone wrong in those areas. But I do think that one of the changes which we can now see having happened in France, having maybe happening in the United States and maybe happening here, is that the conventional centre-right has lost ground to the parties on their right flank and have responded by trying to accommodate those concerns. So, for example, we've seen clear moves in the Republican Party, in the Conservative Party, against some of the green commitments that were made earlier on. And what you could end up with a British Conservative Party, the traditional party of the right, if you don't vote left, you vote right, accommodating right-wing populists like Reform to the extent that they pretty much become the same thing and share the same range of, extreme anti-immigrant, basically Britain first policies in the way that Trump, for example, has populated the Republican Party, which is now, an American first party, which will do whatever he says. And in France, we've also seen, the collapse and the fragmentation of the traditional right, whereas what was seen as the far right, the National Front, now the, National Rally, have increasingly pulled right-wing voters in their direction.
Yeah, these will be definitely developments that we will be watching closely. And you're right, the generation of appealing to young voters and shaping political communication towards them is our responsibility going forward by being mindful of the dynamics that you just outlined. You just mentioned Trump. Everyone after the 4th of July is the 6th of November. The UK and the United States have traditionally a strong relationship and are allies. If a Trump presidency becomes reality and he will be re-elected and we have a Labour government here in the UK, how do you expect the relationships to be moving forward between those countries?
I think that what is evolving between the UK and the US is that in political terms, the United States is ceasing to be the UK's dominant ally, because in each country's terms, it's increasingly clear that we can't rely on each other, that America does put its own interests first. It was, I think, a unique attribute of the UK when we were members of the European Union, that we were seen as a bridge across the Atlantic between North America and the United States in particular, and the European Union, and what's more, an English-speaking nation, and one that had lots of cross-investment. Now, I'm sure that cross-investment will continue, but I don't think the UK is in a position or will be in a position to offer that function of being a bridge. We pretty much blew that up with Brexit, and so and contributed to general political destabilization. So my feeling is that Labour will maintain a very polite relationship with the US. I think that we'll probably stay fairly close to them in terms of votes on the UN Security Council, because, we wish to maintain our position there. But I don't expect that it's feasible, for example, that there could be a big trade deal with the United States. I think it's pretty clear that on agriculture in particular, there's no way that Britain could make the concessions which the United States wants. So I think it will be a polite but not an important one. And that therefore raises the question, what does a Labour government do? Where does it seek out its allies? And, a lot of people would say, well, obviously Europe. And I think the Labour Party, as indeed do the Conservatives, believe that the big thing that the UK has to offer is its contribution to Europe's defence, particularly at a time when maybe President Trump will be withdrawing, maybe, some other countries will be thinking again, possibly France, if the Marine Le Pen's party is dominant about the level of support which they give to Ukraine in its battle with Russia. I'm absolutely sure that whoever wins the election, the UK will continue to be a major defence partner. I mean, the fact that President Zelensky sought out Keir Starmer at the recent D-Day meeting is one sign of that. So the issue will be, to what extent is the UK willing to contribute meaningful defence to the rest of Europe, how that's organised within a European pillar within NATO. And in exchange for participating at that level, what sort of economic participation, cultural participation, and, technological participation will be open to the UK. In other words, you can see how they trade. I mean, there are some people who say, right, Labour wins the election. Everyone is disappointed, because Labour haven't promised much, but they're going to be hard economic times. The obvious thing for the Labour Party to do to assuage the people who voted for it is to move closer to Europe, because 80% of the people who vote for Labour will be pro-Europe. But the problem is Labour has been looking over its shoulder at some of the older voters in working class areas who voted for Brexit, and has already committed to not rejoining the customs union and not rejoining the single market, which incidentally I remember being created by Margaret Thatcher, but that's another story. So the question, I think, will be, will circumstances evolve such that Labour feels it can move in a more pro-European direction?
That's very good to hear as a pro-European and German citizen for myself. We hope that there is a re-establishment of such relationships. But widening out, I just want to stay there. Although the UK is at one of the worst performing G7 economies, however, as you mentioned...
Not according to Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I lived that in the room. But looking at the UK in its wider picture, the United Kingdom is an important UN Security Council member, a big NATO ally, strategic partner in the G7 and the G20. Now looking ahead, when you look at 2026, there is the whole restart of the G20 cycle for the second term. Where do you see the United Kingdom working with its wider international G7, G20 partners after the 4th of July?
Well, it depends who wins. I mean, the likelihood is that Labour will win. And I think Labour will adopt a more cooperative approach with its traditional allies in the G7. And I also think the way politics works, if the polls are right and Keir Starmer wins big, he will be listened to in those sort of international contexts in a way that, frankly, the British Prime Minister has not been listened to since David Cameron took that decision, which the German Chancellor, for example, thought was absolutely absurd to hold a referendum. And indeed, the French were quite scornful that, if they held a referendum, they'd probably lose it. So it was a probably good idea not to call it. So I think bridges will be built, particularly if it's a secure government with a large majority. But I do think certainly if the Conservatives were somewhere or another to win this election, which we don't expect, but even if they are in opposition, that alternative voice will not be a consensus voice on Britain's role in the world, cooperating with its allies. It will be a more extreme, more populist, more suspicious, and, frankly, less conciliatory voice as far as international attachments are concerned.
Perfect, thank you. And now let's move on to the policy matters. I know in nuclear politics everything is around the number 5. So if we were to focus on 5 policy matters, foreign policy matters, what would you think? I mean, you mentioned defense, internal market, trade, collaborations already, but what do you think will be the driving 5 policy matters in the first 100 days that a new government should focus on?
Foreign policy. Right, okay. I think that the first task will be to recommit publicly to supporting Ukraine, and that may well mean increasing possibly what has already been offered to Ukraine in support. Labour has a slight issue in as much as its commitment to increase defence spending is not quite as cast iron in its manifesto as the Conservatives are. They're going to order a security review. A lot of people in the security community think that's unnecessary, are quite cynical about it, but it may well be what Labour needs to convince its supporters that it is necessary to spend more defence. So that's the first thing. Second thing is Israel-Palestine. Both the mainstream opposition parties have made it clear that they would like to diplomatically recognise a state of Palestine. I think that is not as far from the British government position as one might think, because certainly Labour have said that they think they're moving towards recognising a state of Palestine, but that will be within the context of the acceptance of a two-state solution, and not before the two-state solution is delivered, but in the context of moving in that direction. And clearly, as you know, neither Hamas nor Israel under Netanyahu are in that position. So I don't expect dramatic changes there. I think what we've heard is a bit dramatic. I think there will be a degree of apprehension about the American election on the 5th of November. And I think there will be big efforts to try and understand and build links to both sides. There is an outstanding issue as to who is going to be appointed the British ambassador to the United States. The current government wanted to make that appointment, but that was blocked, and protocol suggests that when the election's pending, they shouldn't do it. So it is going to be an appointment made by Labour, and it's possible that some quite prominent figures might be appointed. Some people have talked about David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary, now the head of International Rescue. Some people have talked about Cathy Ashton, the former head of European foreign policy. There's even some talk that David Lammy, who's currently the Shadow Foreign Secretary, might be moved to be the ambassador in Washington, thereby creating an interesting question as to who might become the Foreign Secretary in a Labour government. So I think there is going to be interest on that, and that decision would probably have to come in the first 100 days. I do think that because Labour has quite a lot of minority support from people from the Indian subcontinent and from Africa in particular, there will be a renewed focus on relations with those countries. Does not appear, because of the financial circumstances, that there will be a rapid return to the UN's 0.7% increase in foreign policy. But there are undoubtedly voices in Labour who would like to see an international development department separated from the Foreign Office. That's happened in the past, and that could happen quite quickly when the new government is put up. Personally, I don't think it's going to happen, but it could happen. And finally, I think with the Arab world, of course, headed by Saudi Arabia, there is a realization that there will not be positive progress in the Middle East without those countries, playing a very prominent and constructive role. So I suspect there'll be a lot of diplomacy, really, to recognize that part of the world as a rising power, if you like. I mean, beyond the BRICS, so that notion of the BRICS has kind of rather fallen apart. I mean, what people are talking about now is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, North Korea, and, and possibly South Africa, threatening or challenging, the Western consensus. And, you can see that going on. If that is going on, the West, including the UK, is going to need to find allies in the Middle East.
Yeah, as you said in the late Henry Kissinger's words, are we expecting a new world order? Well, there's clearly a lot of fruitful discussions to be happening this year. But let me ask you a last question. So after all these 70 plus elections this year, you will sit at your Christmas dinner with your family or whoever you have around you. If you would have one guest to invite to this Christmas dinner amongst the world leaders or emerging world leaders that we have, who would that be? The second question is, what would you discuss with them looking ahead to 2025?
I think the person who has the most on his plate and quite possibly needs at least to discuss it, if not advice, at least discuss the situation, is probably Keir Starmer. I mean, I genuinely think that he is someone, as he says himself, who came late to politics. He's only been in politics for 10 years. And I think he's shown that he has, he's a serious person and that he has the grit. But I think he it's going to be a very, very steep learning curve for him if he's elected. And if he's not elected, I think it'd be very interesting to find out why. One thing I would say, though, is that there are those who don't like Keir Starmer, who, when you say, well, why, what's wrong with him? I actually said to my wife the other day, he's a damned atheist. In other words, he's not someone who says he's a Christian and his wife is Jewish. So, he might not be celebrating Christmas.
That's true.
I think he will be. I think he'll be. If he gets a chance, he'll want to turn on the lights in Downing Street.
And if Keir Starmer listens to this and becomes the Prime Minister, he may knock on your door. With that, Adam, thank you so much for your candid and insightful reflections. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.